Well, good morning and welcome everyone to Carrots, Sticks and Consumers, the Future of Energy. My name's Alex Harrington. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Warren Centre. Before we begin today, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to note today, with some sadness, the passing that many of you may not be aware of Professor Rolf Prince yesterday. Professor Prince was a wonderful man, a wonderful chemical engineer, and I may not be an engineer, but I appreciate a discussion on thermodynamics that I had with Rolf as much as anyone. The Warren Centre supports the principle that sound engineering and economics will provide the foundation we need to address the challenges of energy for the future. In this, we are aligned with recent comments by the Australian Government, noting that global initiatives to address rising energy emissions and greenhouse gas emissions is vital to avoid the serious consequences of climate change. Variable wind and solar generation represents dynamic engineering challenges for network stability. And liquefied natural gas exports are driving a huge demand for energy globally that Australia will continue to address. We know that the electricity future will include cleaner energy and storage solutions, but technical challenges cannot be overcome without a stable policy environment to encourage investment. As the Grattan Institute's Tony Wood explained in an opinion piece last week, the well-known energy and climate triple dilemma of reliability, affordability and sustainability is a minefield. Today's discussion may not have all the solutions, but our expert panel will shine some light on some of the detail and the challenges that exist within this equation. I would now like to introduce John Blick, our moderator for today. John is a director of Renaissance Energy Australia, a niche energy consultancy providing management and technical consulting services, including energy project evaluation, development and management, renewable hybrid energy systems modelling, research consulting, energy efficiency, energy and carbon management and workshop facilitation. John has previously held roles with major Australian manufacturing companies, including Orica, ExxonMobil Orica, a joint venture, and CSR, and also spent 2 years in Africa working on solar energy applied research and development projects. John is a chartered chemical engineer and chartered scientist with IKME and actively contributes to a number of professional networks, including current national president of the Australian Institute of Energy. Please join with me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Alex. My role here today is as moderator, so I'll be saying as little as possible and letting the two expert speakers give you the benefit of their accumulated wisdom, which I can assure you is considerable. So thanks, Alex, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What was once the preserve of technocrats and boffins who largely worked in the background to deliver reliable and affordable electricity has over recent years become, if not a barbecue stopper, at least the talk of the town. So much so that nowadays we all talk knowingly about trilemmas, clean energy targets, inertia, decarbonisation, but especially about electricity prices. And the recent release of the Finkel Review has certainly sparked more discussion with its blueprint to transition the electricity system from irresolvable trilemma to winning trifecta. So it is with pleasure and privilege this morning for me to moderate the presentations and discussion from these two speakers who are highly experienced and respected in the energy space. I've heard both of them speak on a number of occasions and I've been impressed by their grasp of the issues and their depth of insight in the complex area of the electricity market, and it is very complex, as we'll see a little bit of today. In just under 20 minutes each, their presentations will, I'm sure, help us to make sense of the complexity. In terms of the way it's going to operate, so they'll speak for just under 20 minutes each, and then there'll be time for a panel discussion and then an opportunity for questions from the floor. So I'll be timekeeping, and I'll be quite ruthless with the timekeeping, so expect to have the speakers gonged off if they overstay their time. But that's the way in which we're going to keep it on track and give everybody an opportunity to come forward with questions later. So our first speaker is Mervyn Davies, and I'll just be brief with these introductions. You have that in your literature. Mervyn Davies has worked in all areas of electricity distribution, and has extensive experience in managing both the financial and technical performance of the business. He's previously held senior management positions at Energy Australia, which is now Ausgrid, of course. He operates an engineering consultancy practice nowadays, specialising in the engineering and economics of the electricity distribution industry. And also he has a number of board appointments, and he holds an honours and master's degree in engineering and also a Bachelor of Commerce in economics. Please welcome Mervyn Davies.
Thank you, John. But before we start, I need to correct a statement in the CV. I am no longer a member of the board of Western Power, TasNetworks or Energex. My terms on those boards have come to fruition, come to an end over the last 18 months. Now that possibly gives me an advantage in that I can now speak much more freely about industry issues. And on that point, I'd like to make this point. When I joined Energex about 6 or 7 years ago, Energex and the whole industry was just coming to the realisation that the era of low growth, a 100-year continuous growth, had suddenly come to an end. It was also the time when PV suddenly became a competition. For the first time in 100 years, we had competition. Gas was never really competition, but PV was competition. It was taking load from us. And we then came to the realisation, well, we now have to price our product correctly. None of our costs in distribution are driven by kilowatt hours. So we started to tell the world, and now the world accepts this as gospel, our costs aren't driven by kilowatt hours, they're driven by demand. And therefore, consequently, demand management matters as well. That's the message we've been giving out to the world for the last 7 or 8 years. Well, I have to tell you that it's a half-truth, because in this era of low load growth, really demand grows, demand drives part of our costs, but a large part of our costs, more than half our costs, aren't driven by anything. They're what economists call residual costs. Hence we have the residual cost dilemma. How do you recover all those past sunk costs, all those investments from the past, which ought to be earning a return? How do you recover that by not pricing into kilowatt hours or into kVA? There's only one answer, and that is to start charging fixed charges up front. That's not going to be very acceptable to our customers, and that's a further dilemma. How do you bring about tariff reform in ways that are acceptable to the community? And of course, demand management for us doesn't matter as much as we thought it did either, because our demand's not growing much. We don't really need a lot of demand management. And when we do, we only need it in spots of the network. At any one time, only 4 or 5% of the network is constrained. That's where we need demand management. We don't need it all over. Well, turning now to the presentation. Electricity pricing for the new energy paradigm. I want to handle this by asking and perhaps canvassing 2 questions. What retail electricity pricing arrangements will best facilitate this move to a low-carbon economy, and what customer participation arrangements will be needed? We will need customer participation. We will need demand management, not so much for networks. We'll need it to match to the variable supply from our renewable generators. So what are the characteristics of the new paradigm? I won't labour this. I'm assuming that we're progressively displacing non-renewables with renewables. That brings with it intermittency of supply, non-synchronous generation, declining natural inertia. I'm not going to say much about that, but we will have distributed energy resources, wind, batteries and PV. What's needed in this new paradigm then? And I'll make this point strongly. For 100 years we've had generation following load. That's got to change. We now have to have substantial following of the available generation, the intermittent supply, by loads. That's the really radical change that has to take place. Storage will help, but even with the most optimistic views about storage, it's not going to be the whole solution. Loads following supply has got to be part of the major part of the solution. Artificial inertia, I'm not going to talk about. Above all, we need pricing reform and we need customer participation. Pricing, we need pricing that accurately signals costs, because that will deliver technology neutrality. That's best achieved by pricing carbon. Now, if that's not politically achievable, and it doesn't look like it in the near term anyway, then the next best thing is neutral incentives that don't favour one renewable over another. We need pricing that customers understand, and we need pricing structures that have broad community acceptance. Customer participation, there's no good giving customers price signals without also giving them the tools to manage to those price signals. So home management, energy systems are vital in this new paradigm. We also need energy ancillary services markets, arrangements that enable DER and customers to participate. And we do still need some demand-side response for networks. Currently, there is very little demand management and demand-side management involving the mass market customer in the system. Before I talk in detail about that, and just how detailed I get will depend upon how ruthless John is, first I want to offer a solution. I want to take each one separately because the solution is quite radical. Firstly, a time variant, that is a time of use energy price. This is pricing for ordinary small customers, domestic and small business. A time variant energy price that reflects the costs of generation and transmission. So I'm advocating that transmission should become a generator responsibility, and that the cost of don't look at me like that. And that transmission costs, along with the capital investment in generation, all be settled in the national market. Secondly, an annual demand charge that reflects the customer's average demand measured over just 400 hours a year when the system's likely to peak. That would be to recover the investment in networks. A small fixed charge to recover the customer-related costs in both retail and networks. And finally, and this is quite radical as well, a customer-specific annuity in perpetuity to cover all distribution, high voltage and low voltage mains. Essentially, more than half of a distributor's costs are in connecting customers to the transformers. And the costs, the extent of those networks is determined by customer spacing. If your customers are sparse, you need lots of mains. If they're all packed close together like they are here in the CBD of Sydney, actually centimetres apart on average, you don't need the same level of investment in mains, even though they may be more sophisticated. We need home energy management systems, as I previously mentioned, and they'll need to respond both to the time of use energy and the time of use demand components of the tariff. And we need aggregators, and this is critical. We need aggregators who pay the mass market customers, the domestic customers, for the right to interrupt their appliances, non-time imperative appliances, and there's plenty of them. Hot water's one, air conditioning's another, refrigeration is another, the list goes on. Interrupt them briefly, very briefly, to support ancillary services, interrupt them for longer periods to trade in the market in a manner which enables them then to follow the available supply from the intermittent generators. And we'll need some DSM for networks as well, but that DSM has to be quite time and spatially differentiated. It's not offered across the board, it's offered where the constraints are. Electricity pricing. To understand electricity pricing, you first need to understand what can be settled in a market. If it can be settled in a market, it's a kilowatt hour cost. You secondly need to understand industry cost drivers, and finally customer behaviour. Now those three set the rest of the agenda. I'll get through as much of it as I can. But the complication is that the industry has four separate components: transmission, generation, distribution and retail. And they've all got shortcomings. The shortcoming in generation is the asymmetry of this market and the fact that we have hedge contracts. Retail customers don't see the spot price. The bidding that goes on, 5-minute interval bidding, is bidding of short-run marginal cost in order to get dispatched. Revenue is backed and supported by the hedge contracts, which set relatively stable prices for end-use customers. So the market gets settled at the level of the demand set by the hedge contract price, but the supply is set by the spot contract price. It really isn't a balanced market at all. And it won't be until we get serious demand-side participation. The network shortcoming is that our costs are fundamentally fixed. Transmission depends upon the distance between the load centres and the generators. For distribution, depends on where the customers are, how close together they are, in both cases fixed capacity costs. The shortcoming, and this is the one we really have to address, is that we traditionally charge kilowatt hours for kilowatt hours to recover these costs. We can't do that anymore. The AEMC has decreed that we will move to long-run marginal costs. The industry is slowly moving there by introducing demand tariffs. They're not doing it very well, but they're at least introducing them. Moving on, kilowatt hours as a cost driver. Briefly consider this. The only true kilowatt hour driven cost is the cost of the fuel, the gas, the coal, and the opportunity value of water if you've got water stored. Fuels can be stockpiled, so we've always considered them to be a variable cost. What's more important than them being stockpilable is that because we have networks, every generator is connected to every customer, so we have a market. If one customer doesn't use it, another will. When is it appropriate then to use kilowatt hours? Obviously when it's a cost driver, but more importantly when the price can be settled in a market. Let's look at each segment. For halfway, that's not too bad. For generation, the costs are a mix of fuel costs and capital. They're all settled in the market. If you think about a renewable energy generator now, what are his energy costs? They're nothing. They really are nothing or next to nothing. All of the costs are capital costs. They too can be settled in the market. For distribution, our costs aren't driven by kilowatt hours, but what's more, there is a nexus, a connection between the individual customer and the mains that serve him. And in red there, if the mains and the transformer in your street aren't used by you and your neighbours, who the hell does use them? No one. So if you're going to establish markets, they've got to be very small markets, about the size of your street. That's simply not practicable. What's happening? What have I done? For transmission, costs aren't driven by kilowatt hours either. But the difference with transmission is that the customer collectives are huge. There's the whole load centres. The City of Sydney is a load centre. The City of Wollongong, the City of Newcastle. So it is possible to run markets for transmission costs. It's much more practical instead to allocate those costs, and we've got plenty of allocation algorithms with which to do it, allocate those costs to generators. These costs can then be recovered as part of the kilowatt hour cost in a market. That's important for two reasons. It solves part of the residual cost dilemma of the distribution businesses. No longer do we have to recover those sunk costs in transmission. They're recovered through a kilowatt hour price genuinely settled in the market. But also it establishes competitive neutrality between the distributed energy resources that are sitting in the load centres and those remote generators who are sitting at the ends of the transmission lines. Briefly about industry cost structures, and I'll make this point seriously. For networks, for distribution networks, broadly speaking, in a mature urban network that's not growing at the edges, we have assets which serve two purposes. One is to provide capacity. These are the zone and sub-transmission stations. They're the transformers. The rest, the low voltage and the high voltage main, connect customers to that network. And they are largely driven by the spacing between customers. A little more complex than that, but I haven't got time to go into it. Load growth is achieved by injecting more frequently into those mains networks. More distribution centres, more zone substations. The problem today is the long-run marginal cost of demand is low. Our dilemma, therefore, is that we have residual costs dominating, and they're set by customer spacing. And that's why I'm advocating a customer-specific charge, depending on where you are in the network, how far you are from your neighbours, specifically, ideally, worked out at the time that you connect, as an annuity in perpetuity. For transmission costs, these two suffer the fact the long-run marginal cost is low, although arguably with some of the augmentation that may be required for renewables, you might want to revise that. I don't, because I think most of those are in the nature of a generation and demand related cost. The costs are locationally differentiated to account for distance between the DNSPs and the load centres. In the absence of interconnectors, transmission charges are largely an additional residual cost that the distributors currently have to deal with. These two are dominated by residual costs. The implication for end customer pricing, currently transmission costs get passed on to the distributors. The distributors see the residual costs, it adds to the residual cost dilemma. If they were charged to the remote central generators, then they would be settled in the market. We'd be relieved of a problem in the distribution business, and there would be competitive neutrality between the DERs and the remote generators. The generation cost structure, again, they're a mix of capital and OPEX. It depends upon the nature of your plant, whether it's base plant, intermediate peaking or renewables. Again, renewables is entirely capital. Regardless of the mix, it can be settled in the market. Even that zero short-run marginal cost renewable. So if you're zero short-run marginal cost renewable, what do you do? Well, it's not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. The hydro in Tasmania has been dispatching run-of-the-river hydro, where if you don't use the water, you can't store it, it just flows down the river. Long-run marginal cost, absolute, short-run marginal cost, absolutely zero. They've been dispatching this for years. It's simply bid in at zero. It gets dispatched every time, unless one of the big generators decides to bid negatively, which they do occasionally. So the same can be expected with wind and solar. The problem here is that 2 minutes left. Dear me, it was 5. The problem here is that if we are predominantly bidding zero, the market's going to flip-flop from zero to vol overnight. Those with access to storage would bid the opportunity value of the stored energy, and that's important, but more importantly, the DM aggregators would bid the customer deprival value. I won't go there. Customer behaviour, very briefly. Customers don't do things at the same time. There is diversity between customer usage. This means that the collective demand, average per customer, is typically 1/3 of the individual customer's demand. And that's the basis of the economics of networks. But more importantly, I think, for demand management, is that when you interrupt a customer or some of his appliances and then switch them on an hour later, the load that you switch on is higher than the load that you switch off. So you have to have very good governance of how they get returned to service. Customer apathy means that we need to give them load management systems, and high fixed annual prices will not gain community acceptance unless we're able to offer a social tariff that relieves the disadvantage of the need to pay capital fixed charges. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave the summary of conclusions because my 2 minutes, I think, is just about up. So I look forward to your questions.
Well, you can just a quick summary would be great, and then we'll go on to Paul.
Okay, well, look, and I've done that again.
Or just press escape
Escape.
on the computer.
Oh.
There we go.
The cost of electricity to retail, that is the end-use customer, the small end-use customer, is dominated by residual costs of transmission and distribution. And these aren't kilowatt-hour driven costs. Energy represents currently possibly as little as 10%. Yes, it's gone up in the last few months. It's gone from about 5 cents to nearly 8, 9 cents in the state, almost 10 cents in South Australia, weighted average. Generation is settled as kilowatt hours in the NEM. Now, when you settle it in the NEM, you settle your capital costs as well. That goes up to maybe around about 25% all up. If you add transmission to that, you start to push the genuine kilowatt hour charging up to around about 35%. Fixed customer costs, both retail and network, represent about 15%. Distribution demand-driven costs are maybe around 20%, maybe not even that high, depending on load growth scenarios. And the distribution residual costs, being largely those customer connection costs, low and high voltage mains, they represent about 30%. of the overall cost stack. Again, we do need customer bidding, because it's only with customer bidding, demand-side bidding, that we can hope to start to match the output from the renewables to the demand that's available. Plenty of opportunity, even those opportunities to sink load. I've got under-floor heating in my house. If someone's bidding zero, I'm very happy for them to pump their excess energy into under-floor heating. And we need demand-side through aggregators. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
That's a very dense presentation, Mervyn. Thank you. You got through that well, and those key points I think are pretty clear at the end there: the pricing and customer participation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Let me just introduce now quickly Paul Graham, who's Chief Economist of Energy at CSIRO. In that role, he's responsible for advice on the global and national economic context relevant for the energy sector, setting the strategic direction for economic and social science research, and leading major projects. He's developed and led the landmark Future Grid Forum project in 2013, which almost everybody in the energy space knows about, an excellent piece of work, and recently also completed the Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap, which was an equally excellent piece of work, in partnership with the Energy Networks Australia ENA. So please join me in welcoming Paul Graham.
Thanks. It does seem like a sort of a time when Australia is doing a lot of roadmap exercises and planning. I suppose that reflects the sort of lack of planning in the system and some of the consequences we've seen. I am going to draw mainly on the network roadmap experience, but we also did a low emission technology roadmap for the government, which was more focused on how we meet our Paris climate targets. But I think the network roadmap is the one that most sort of considers this question of how do we get the best outcome for customers, because I think that's the ultimate goal. And the roadmap made the call that we need to deliver, keep bills as low as possible, need a secure and reliable system. Now, when we asked stakeholders and customers, they actually said they want a zero-emission sector, so they didn't want to just meet the Paris climate targets. They wanted to go further than that. They also wanted to continue to have more choice. People are exercising choice to diversify their electricity supply by generating some of their own power, rooftop solar. But some of that also raises fairness issues. So where we are today is that we've had a long period of increasing electricity bills. There is more than a strong suggestion that some customers, the cross-subsidies between customers is increasing. We've had some really major poor outcomes in terms of system security in the last 12 months. We're still fairly high emission per capita, although the electricity sector did peak a few years ago. We've just started increasing emissions again in the last year. But we have had this really successful world-leading adoption of rooftop solar, which brings with it some of its own issues. Where the roadmap tries to get to is to improve every one of those outcomes. It thinks the long-term, very long-term outcome is probably about 2/3 of customers based on our sort of the amount of detached housing and commercial rooftop space. If we use some of that capacity to save the system on some of the system costs, we think there's about $100 billion of savings, or avoided $400 in bills overall, if we can do some of the things that Mervyn talked about in terms of demand-side management. There's also an opportunity to reduce cross-subsidies as we do that, as we change the structure of the pricing. But also bringing demand-side management into the mix of ways of managing the load also improves our security outcomes as well. It's an extra pillar we can lean on when we're getting to times where energy supply and demand is critical. And as I said, our stakeholders said, we want zero emissions, show us how to get to zero emissions. So we did that, and that's probably what I'm going to focus on the most in the next couple of minutes. So we have a roadmap outcome, which I just described, and we also had the counterfactual. And the counterfactual was kind of muddling along, still reducing emissions over time, but not really taking advantage of the opportunities presented by distributed energy resources and demand management. And consequently, not having the confidence to be able to integrate renewables as well. So a lesser outcome in terms of emissions. And as this chart shows, the roadmap really aims for zero emissions by 2050, whereas if we're kind of just muddling along, we've got uncertain policy, we haven't brought customers along for the ride, we're probably not going to be able to get the same level of abatement outcome. So when the stakeholders said to us, aim for zero emissions by 2050, we ended up going down this path of doing that with renewables. That's not the only way to get there. We could have done nuclear. CCS would have got us close if it was CCS with gas. We ended up using renewables for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was that we saw that our customers were taking up more or less systems, renewables and batteries, so we thought we're going to be using that anyway, so we should try and use that. The other thing is this doesn't require any changes in laws and doesn't require any new technology to be demonstrated, so it's all off-the-shelf technology that you can buy now. So we thought this is a kind of a reasonable approach, but the roadmap actually says, you know, whatever policy is put in place should be technology neutral, so it doesn't have to be this outcome. So the outcome here, if it's not obvious, is we've got a huge amount of, in yellow, rooftop solar at the top there. There's also large-scale solar just below that, and then the paler blue is wind. So we're scaling down coal over time and replacing that mostly with solar and wind. And the question is, how on earth does that become a reliable electricity supply? That's the big question. So what we had to do was a lot of simulation and testing. So what we did was we looked at each state over time, and they all go to different levels of renewables over time. It's not, although it looks even there, all the states are not moving in at the same time. So that's why you get quite a lot of diversity in this modelling. What we tried to do is we did simulations within a year to try and you know, detailed half-hourly simulations to figure out how much storage would you need to back that up. And the answer seemed to work out that over time, initially you need none, depending on where you are. So most states already have some flexible generation, some coal, some gas. So for states where you're not even at 30 or 40%, the modelling sort of said you can use the existing flexibility. But beyond that, you really have to add something else. And so around 30 to 50%, we found you're having to add something. We use batteries, not because we're against pumped hydro, but there's just more data on batteries. And the model started taking up batteries once we get into that 50% range. And we found that we were deploying about 1 kilowatt of batteries for every kilowatt of renewables by the time we got to very, very high renewable uptake. So once we got to about 90% variable renewables, we were deploying 1 kilowatt of batteries for every kilowatt of renewables. That's hard to get your head around, so another way of thinking about it is this chart, which is the same data but just rearranged differently. So what we're saying is we need about 8 hours of batteries at average state load, is another way of thinking about it. So in every state, roughly, and it does differ a little bit, you've got enough battery storage capacity to cover 8 hours of average state load. Why stop at 8? The question, what we sort of started to run into is that the worst case is not the peak day. The peak day, you're going to have lots of sunshine in most states. It's a summer peaking day, and your batteries are going to be full. The problem day that we found was your low wind, low sun day. So a mild day with not much wind but not a lot of sun either. That's when you're in trouble, and that can go on from a couple of days in a few states. We found a few examples where that went on for 3 days, almost a week in some states. So what do? Well, you don't put in a week's worth of storage. That was incredibly expensive when we started looking at that solution. So when you do this solution, you have to actually build all of that as peaking capacity. So what you're going to do is you're going to have all those renewables, you're going to have all that storage, and then for a week or two a year, you're going to need up to about the level of this average state load, because it's a mild day, remember. You're going to have to build a bunch of peaking capacity to come in on those days. So it's peaking capacity that's hardly ever going to be used. It's just sitting there for most of the year. It's pretty cheap. It's hardly using any fuel because it's only operating, but you need it there. That's the only way to make this system operate. And it's a lot cheaper than, as I said, trying to build a week's worth of storage. So how does that look? Is that ridiculously expensive? When we started looking at it, so we've got our 8 hours storage, or a kilowatt per kilowatt by 2050. Because it's sort of average state load, it works out about 0.4 kilowatts of dispatchable capacity. Operating on gas initially, but we have to switch to biogas in the last few years to get to zero emissions. Obviously all of that doesn't take care of frequency, so you've also got to deploy a bunch of synchronous condensers, which are surprisingly cheap. They're not very expensive. So when we add all this up, this is just taking an example over time of solar power, and you're gradually increasing the share of that in the system. You have to start adding more batteries. So by the time we get to about 90% solar in this case, but you could think about that as also solar and wind. We've added our equal capacity of batteries, our synchronous condensers, our peaking gas plants. It works out a bit over $120 a megawatt hour by the time you get to 2050, taking into account that the cost of solar and batteries are falling all through that period. So that's how it looks from a kind of intuitive bottom-up perspective. When you put it into a system model, one of the things that you realise is the electricity price has to peak when you need that capacity built, and it's not in 2050. You actually start building all of that mainly around the 2030s. And that's because that's when a lot of our plant retire. I remember I think I was about an 11-year-old, I went to the opening of the Eraring power plant in 1982, 3-ish. And maybe I'll get to go to the closure or whenever that is, but if it's at the 50th birthday, it'll be in the early 2030s. And same with Bayswater, it's around that time as well. Our really big plants are going to come off in the 2030s, and that's when we'll need this huge price signal to build all that renewables and storage. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of that wind and solar will be spilling power, particularly in summer, and so their costs are actually a bit higher because their capacity factor is going to be lower than if they were just able to operate whenever they were able to operate. They're going to be spilling a lot of power, so if the capacity factor is 35%, in reality it might be in the 20s, just because they won't get to export all that power. So that's generation, and then if we implement some of the things Mervyn was talking about for demand management, you can see the bottom line, or the top line in that bottom chart is where we'd probably normally head if we don't change our pricing structures in Australia. But if we're able to get people involved with their solar systems and their battery systems on site in demand management, we think we can actually descale the distribution system, so we can actually start to bring the size of the system down and hopefully save some money on the amount of distribution network that we need in particular. That, in that case, would mean that we can probably just flatten out distribution costs for the rest of the next few decades. If we don't succeed that, we're going to continue to see distribution costs rise because, as Mervyn said, with lower volumes expected, they'll just have to put up prices to keep recovering that residual. So that's the consequence if we don't implement that pricing reform. So when we put together the generation system that the roadmap was aiming for and the pricing reforms that Mervyn was talking about, we think we can avoid about $400 in residential bills by 2050. So if the average bill now is $1,500, under the counterfactual it goes to about $2,200 in the long run. But we can keep that increase to about $1,800, so we can avoid that $400 and keep it to only, I think $300 over 3 decades is not too bad. I think we can afford that. I think that's a reasonable to get zero emissions and everybody with lots of choice and so forth. I think it's not a bad outcome. The big savings are really around the customer not having to spend so much to save on its own electricity bills. So the customer doesn't have to put in so much PV and storage just to achieve a lower bill. It actually achieves a lower bill with less equipment on their side of the meter, because they're getting paid now to provide services to the distribution networks. The networks are not building as much. The generation sector is building about the same, but overall that's how we sort of, when we add all this up, we find about $100 billion in savings. How am I doing? 2 minutes? Now the other thing is this question of fairness and equity. And so I just talked then about the average customer. The average customer, of course, doesn't exist. So we tried to, and we went into a lot of detail here. We broke Australia up into about 2,000 different substation zones. And we came up with representative customers in each of those zones. And within our representative customers, we had some demographics available. And so these customer types, this working couple, medium family that I've got here, these are the closest examples nearest to the cluster of load that is most common. So these are, what I'm saying is these are reasonably representative load profiles that we're using here. And what I'm disappointed in is they don't really represent the demographics in Australia. So there's not a single parent family here, but this is the best we could find in the limited data. And you'll see for all of them, well, let me explain active and passive. Active is a customer who will take up the best tariff and distributed energy technology combination available to them. Whether that's, maybe they just have storage, maybe they have just solar, or maybe they have a solar battery bundle, or maybe they have something else, but that's an active customer. A passive customer is someone who, for whatever reason, just takes the regular retail bill that's available and doesn't take up any technology. Maybe it's because they're renting, maybe it's because they've just got limited finances, maybe if they're just like me and they're saving for a kitchen, so they're not buying solar at the moment. And you can see both in the counterfactual and the roadmap, you are definitely better off. Unfortunately, this is the future that we're coming to. You are better off if you can access distributed energy. We don't think there's a lot we can do about that. No matter what world you're in, you're going to be better off, just given where electricity prices are going and the cost of technology are going. You'll be better off if you can access some sort of distributed energy in the long run. This is 2050. God knows what this means. This probably means you can get a solar system for $500. I don't know. I can't remember the exact cost, but this is quite cheap. Okay. Now the question is, what the roadmap tried to do was to narrow this gap between the active and passive customers. You'll see in the counterfactual it can be pretty big. It can be anywhere between $500 and $1,200. The types of reforms that Mervyn was talking about to prices, together with the fact that any system savings are passed on to all customers, not just the active customers, means that the roadmap narrows that gap. And that's the idea of delivering more fairness. So that essentially, if you are unfortunately a passive customer, you're at least better off under the roadmap than the counterfactual, even though you're not better off than active customers. All right, that's it.
Paul and Mervyn, if I can ask you both to come up now and let's just take a seat. Those mics are actually on, so you could use them as handheld if you wish. So what we're going to do now is just have a short time of Q&A just with the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So plenty of things there to talk about and ask about. I guess what I'd like to lead off with is just a question for Merv. We've just seen a bit of a political debacle with the attempt by the New South Wales government to shift the emergency services levy recovery onto rateable properties. So your concept of the annuity in perpetuity type thing, Merv, would you like to comment on the political saleability or doability of a radical change like that?
I must say I am not very optimistic about the rate of change towards genuinely cost-reflective pricing. And you cite the reason there. The moment you start to shift the incidence of charges from one group of customers to another group of customers, you get reaction. As far as the annuity in perpetuity, it is the ideal solution. The other solution, and it'll take 50 years, is that when customers connect, then you ask them to pay up front for their connection. We do it now. We ask customers to pay up front for their connection. But then we don't charge them the whole lot. The AER insists that you provide them with the NPV value of their future revenue. If we change that and instead put them onto a different energy price, then we could gradually transition to an arrangement whereby customers pay for the mains up front, and then they're only paying through their energy charge for the energy that they get through the system, and of course a small demand charge for the capacity that's required in the network. So yeah, it is a real challenge, but the biggest impediment, as the industry sees it, is the disadvantaged customer. If you are able to offer not just discounts, but complete avoidance of those fixed costs, whether they be the annuity in perpetuity or the small fixed customer costs, if you can offer those as a discount to disadvantaged customers in the way that Sydney Water does right now, then you've got a chance of getting the rest of the community to accept the payment of fixed charges in exchange for lower energy prices.
Yeah, I mean, I could comment on that one as well. It is almost an intractable problem, almost like the climate change policy, because there's winners and losers. So government, whatever decision government makes around it, they'll have some group of people they put offside. I think that's why I spent that last 2 minutes trying to emphasise this long-term problem around cost subsidies. We will reach a point where you'll harm more people by not changing these pricing structures. Effectively, there will be a group of haves and have-nots. And particularly the consumer groups who represent our most vulnerable people who, probably aren't owners of a detached house with the opportunity to add solar are going to be the ones that end up paying the highest costs in the system. So at the moment, I think some of those consumer groups have spent the last few years saying don't change prices. We're not convinced that everyone will be. But we think there's too many losers in that equation. I think that'll switch at some point. At some point, it would be, well, for how long can we have a small group of less advantaged people paying higher prices for a system where other people are just getting a bit more of a free ride? At some point, I think the political dynamic around that will change.
Yeah, I guess that's the challenge to paint the picture from particularly consumer organisations that the do-nothing option will ultimately be worse. But given the status quo anti-bias, or if you like inertia, to coin a phrase, of social change or whatever, it'll be hard to get that across the line, which is of course what we're seeing in a lot of cases now with electricity market reforms and winners and losers. Another question for Merv before I have a couple of specific ones for Paul. Transmission network costs, your other proposal, shifting those or recovering those via the generators. Any particular obstacles or issues you see to implementing that, achieving that?
Yeah, the generators, the central generators, at the inception of the market, when the market was originally designed back there in the 90s, there was plenty of proposals to seek the generators paying for transmission costs. It's logical after all. They're out there, hundreds of kilometres away. The load's here. It costs money to get from here to here. Why wouldn't they pay? They won the debate then, and they've been winning the debate ever since. And I see Mike looking sterner and sterner the longer I look at him. That will be the generators, and the generators' opposition to picking up these costs will be the biggest stumbling block. But maybe even the generators will ultimately realise that while these costs come through to the end-use generator as a fixed cost, and politically that won't be acceptable, then it will make sense for them to be incorporated as a market-determined energy price. Whether you want to comment, Mike, or not?
Oh, no, I tend to agree with you, but and we have the dilemma of the geothermal power demanding that transmission lines be brought to them rather than they deliver to the market.
Okay, very good. Okay, so for Paul, I guess you've sort of partially answered this already, but the the striking slide is the one with the generation price outcomes, I think, with the significant gap that opens up from 2030 through 2035, the big difference between the roadmap price and the counterfactual, which is a gap of something like $50 per megawatt hour. I guess that would be a politicians take warning type sign there in terms of prepare for something like that. But we're seeing some of that now already, obviously. Your feeling about how that can be resolved politically? How do we talk about that in a way that's going to make sense and possibly avoid that? You're talking about a price signal that's needed to drive that change. How does that work out from your perspective?
Well, it doesn't work out very good if you think you're in a world where we can, we'll have sort of $50 a megawatt hour power forever. But I think the big political shift in the last few months has really been the understanding that we thought we could have $50 a megawatt hour and sit on that for a while, but we're actually getting towards $100 a megawatt hour already, just on the basis that we're getting retirements and the market's getting tighter due to the lack of investment, due to the lack of clear signals about where energy and climate policy is going in Australia. So I think that's fairly well accepted now, and so and one of the specific things that Finkel brought into his modelling of the business as usual in his report was to add a premium to investment in the business as usual to investment in conventional power, and that's really to try and recognise that fact that to finance something without clear climate policy would be quite expensive. So I don't think it's actually that hard now to argue for a decarbonisation pathway that results in prices that are heading towards that $100 a megawatt hour mark, because we're sort of seeing them already. I think a couple of years ago to talk about that as an acceptable outcome was not very well received. But I think we're kind of now starting to understand that the alternative is not very different in terms of pricing, and it's a lot less secure. So, our scenario costs in some of those renewables plus a bunch of technology that needs to go with it to make sure that it actually can do supply reliably. And so it's interesting that from our perspective that we just came up with that with the model without trying to say, well, the NEM needs to go to a capacity market, or we didn't really say how that would happen. Finkel's actually come out with a plan, in the last few months about how that would happen. He's essentially saying, there'd be this security board, and then each state would have a regional assessment where essentially people with variable renewables would be told, okay, these are your reliability standards, these are your security standards, so you'll have to bring these technologies with you when you deploy it. So it turns out it's not that different to what we came up with in the roadmap, except Finkel's brought a process to it. So I think, the combination of acceptance that we're going to get higher prices even in the business as usual, plus a bit more of a plan about how we actually bring some of this stuff together, I'm actually more confident that, politicians won't be so scared away from these sorts of scenarios.
Could I make a comment about political will? Because I've argued these issues around board tables for 10 years now. There's no point trying to change the views of politicians. The views you have to change is the views of the constituents who vote in politicians. Politicians listen to their constituents. We have to get our message out to the wider community, and that's why forums like this are so important. Right, this is a pretty select group, but nevertheless, it's an influential group. If you can get the message out to ordinary people that we have to have these changes and why we have to have these changes, then it makes it very easy for the politicians to come to line.
good insight. All right, thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor now. And if you wouldn't mind just stating your name and your affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Tyree, Tyree Foundation. I want to pick up on Merv's last comment as to who is influential, not the politicians but the general public. So it's in that vein that I speak, Merv. All of the modelling, and Finkel got it right in terms of enabling us to come out with or go back to traditional type coal if it's going to meet targets of emissions. But I don't think the public has understood in any of the modelling what the industry's needs are. All of what we've seen here today doesn't seem to me to cater for the fact that we are shipping our resources out of this country. If you want to get on a plane, go to Iceland, Reykjavik, you'll see bauxite from Australia about as far geographically as what you can, because Australian electricity is now too expensive to run a refinery for aluminium or a smelter. And that's an easy to see thing. But I don't think in our modelling and in our planning the public is getting enough understanding about what a baseload's role can be in supporting big industry that we have in Australia.
Okay, good point. Thanks, Peter. So I guess that's more of a comment than anything else, but either of you guys want to comment on that in terms of the implications? And it's something that's dear to my heart as well, coming from an industry background, energy-intensive industry background, and seeing those industries under the hammer at the moment. What does the future hold, and how do we sit vis-a-vis our competitiveness with the rest of the world? They're the big issues that we really need to make sure is up in the public debate, instead of just as a knee-jerk, but trying to integrate that into what does the future look like for us as an economy. So
let me just help you with one extra fact. Mount Isa Mines are at Strata, $200 million on their mining operations in Mount Isa Mines and Townsville, where they refine their copper. $200 million, and they are now at absolute threat of closing that down. That close down will then affect the ability of manufacturers, of transformer manufacturers, I can tell you, finding the copper cost in their transformers now, and aluminium's similar, going up, that they won't be able to compete against imports.
Well, I can tell you, Peter, Bell Bay Aluminium is still operating in Tasmania.
Yep.
Under a cloud, they've been under a cloud for the last 2 decades.
Yes.
Hopefully they will survive. I guess the point I would make is that when it comes to large industry, like you're talking about, the sort of distribution costs that I've been talking about aren't relevant. The transmission costs, yes, but the transmission costs are quite small in the total. So for very large industry, it's the cost of energy that really dominates. It's 80, maybe even 85% of their total energy bill. And that is the dilemma, particularly as we move into more renewables. The environment will be such that energy will cost more, and I think that's pretty much what Paul's been saying. If those industries can be selective and pick up the load that's being dumped, because there will be a lot of energy being dumped by wind in particular, if they can pick that up, then perhaps there's some opportunity for them. Usually they can't, because they have very static, stable demand for energy. I don't have a solution, Peter.
Can I just ask, throw it to Paul now, just to say there's a lot of modelling around, depending on assumptions, right? There's often modellers at 10 paces nowadays. So your understanding of the modelling in terms of where electricity prices are headed under these various scenarios, not only the ones that CSIRO has done, but other modelling you've seen, what's the range of sort of models, modelling outcomes on prices in terms of, impacting on our competitiveness in the future? What are you seeing there?
They all end up at that roughly $100 megawatt hour mark, to meet the Paris climate commitments. It'll be a little bit higher than that if you have a steeper target in the long run, a little bit lower if you, a bit better at controlling demand growth, or, it also depends on this type of policy. Some policies in particular, better at the way they structure the policy so that it just leads to a lower price outcome. So it's in that range, 80 to 120 with about 100 in the middle. Coming back to your point, I mean, I suppose I've been following the climate debate for 17 years. It's I almost wonder if the whole industry sector in Australia made a miscalculation around. I think they thought that if we get rid of a climate policy, we'll go back to $40, $50 megawatt hour power, right? I think that was the calculation. But getting rid of the climate policy led to not enough investment in the capacity, closures, uncertainty, and has led to a higher price outcome than I think if we actually had kept the carbon policy. The previous carbon policy at least had a mechanism for compensating energy-intensive export-exposed industries. There's no compensation from the business as usual. So I mean, what we see now is Business Council of Australia, all of industry, the mining sector, everybody calling for a clear carbon policy because the calculation now is it'll be cheaper power if we actually have a clear policy. But the problem is, in the meantime, the damage has been done to industry. We've got high gas prices, high electricity prices, and we're losing industry.
Okay. Gordon.
Thanks, Rob. Gordon Leach from Energetics. Both fascinating talks touched on the issue of fairness. One challenge we face, and I'd like to get your comments on this, that what strikes me is so much of our energy policy is driven by the notion of fairness and not penalising resource-poor families. As a result, we've totally distorted the energy markets, and maybe a better solution is to say we will have a pure energy market and fund people who struggle with energy poverty out of the welfare budget, not the energy budget.
So, is that a comment or a question?
For response.
Well, it is very much in line with the comment I made about the industry having recognised that we will only be able to make this transition to, I won't call them fair tariffs, but to efficient tariffs if we are able to offer the disadvantage relief from the fixed charges. It has the advantage that, yes, it deals with those disadvantaged customers, the resource-deprived customers, but it also maintains the right price for energy and the right price for demand. Overall, it may reduce their overall bills by 30-40%. I agree with you. But whether that comes out of the budget, social welfare budget, or whether it comes from the industry is another debate. Arguably, it can come from the industry simply by increasing the fixed costs to the rest of the customer base. And that wouldn't necessarily destroy the economics of the industry.
Paul?
The industry wouldn't like it, and I couldn't normally say that, but now I'm not.
I think it depends which particular cost subsidy you're concerned about. I'm more concerned about the cost subsidy that's going to happen between the technology haves and have-nots. If you're just more worried about general energy poverty, then yeah, the electricity sector should just concentrate on delivering kilowatt hours as efficiently as possible. They shouldn't necessarily be focused on welfare. But if you actually want demand management and to avoid this cross-subsidy around technology haves and have-nots, I think there is an argument for something other than kilowatt hours. I'd probably go a little bit further than Mervyn and say, I think, yes, let's start with some different structures around demand management and so forth. But I think what we actually need to get to is something more sophisticated where people come along and say, hey, we know you don't want to think about your bill and you don't want to think about technology. We'll install this. Your bill last year was $1,500. I can guarantee it'll be $1,300 for the next 5 years if you do this with me. And I'll take care of it, and I'll be making a lot more money out of it than the customer, but if the customer gets a lower bill and doesn't have to think about it, I think they'll be happy as well.
So, I
would make, Paul, if we were able to restructure our tariffs so that the kilowatt hour rate, the energy rate, did simply reflect the cost of remote generation and the cost of the fuel, then this disparity between those with technology and those without will diminish considerably. And perhaps the technology will really have its value in what it can contribute to ancillary service and to through low volume demand, which is still a disparity between those who can and those who can't afford, but it becomes an investment then rather than a means of avoiding paying the full fare, which is the situation currently.
Thank you. And we just have time for one last question from Martin.
Thank you, Chairman. Martin Thomas, ATSI. Chairman, two absolutely excellent presentations and very thought-provoking, and thank you, and thank you to the Warren Centre for putting them on. I give myself quite a number of talks on energy futures, not as erudite as yours, I assure you, but in them, my question is addressed to you, Paul. In them, I do use the CSIRO Energy Futures, e-Futures program, I'm not sure if that's still current, which was based on, I think, 2015 Australian Energy Technology Assessment. In that, there is the option, and you probably know exactly what I'm going to say, there's the default option is no nuclear in that. There's the customer choice option, the user choice option with nuclear. And in my presentations, I paced up the two side by side. They're not dramatically dissimilar. What is very interesting is that renewables, as you post, don't change a great deal. The real change is that nuclear is base load and low, high capital, low cost, tends to replace coal as the trifecta of benefits it brings. So my question to you is this: the roadmap specifically excludes nuclear power. Is that a political choice, or is it a choice because it's currently illegal, or is it a choice because there's a perception of no social license, or is it cost? I'd be interested in your response, and I respect what you say.
Yeah, there was a number of reasons we made that choice. One was we could only choose one, and because we wanted to have one roadmap destination, if you like, and we had to get to zero. So it probably was a combination of renewables with batteries, or pumped hydro, or renewables with nuclear. And I mean, CCS doesn't quite get there to zero, although you have to get to zero. You know, there's other sectors in the economy. So the position the roadmap takes is we recommend a strictly technology neutral approach, but for the roadmap we have to pick one approach. And we pick renewables just because of those issues you raised. It's existing technology, renewables, everything's off the shelf, whereas nuclear would be new, and we'd have to go into a lot of work to justify, you know, all the issues associated with nuclear power, whereas the other stuff is, you know, it's all technology that's available.
All right, thank you. I'll just make just a couple of comments, I guess, to wrap up, and that's to thank the speakers, Paul and Mervyn. That's been fantastic. It's just given us a very brief snapshot, but I think the slides will be available for participants to go through at your leisure. And I guess I'd like to leave it on a positive note, which is that the Finkel Review, for example, for all, you know, nothing's perfect, but it does give, as Paul was saying, a sort of a ways and means forward for the transition that ultimately does need to happen. And it's all about understanding that in detail and understanding how to do that in the most cost-effective way possible, and in a way that grasps the opportunities. There's plenty of challenges there, but grasps the opportunities, particularly for Australia, as really a smart economy, a knowledge-based economy, to potentially develop new systems and technologies and ways of doing things around all of this transition that we can also export to the rest of the world, that knowledge-type export. So that's sort of the bright side of all of this. Plenty of challenges, but with the right will and the right level of caution as well, it's doable. It's just there will be winners and losers, and it's about how we deal with that as a polity in general. So thank you again, and please join me in thanking. Just before I hand back to Alex, I do want to make a plug on behalf of the Australian Institute of Energy, and it's good that Martin has not belled the elephant in the room, I'm not sure what that is, but talked about the nuclear question. Next week, Tuesday evening, there'll be an evening presentation by the AIE Sydney branch by Tony Irwin, who's in the room today, nuclear engineer and lecturer at ANU, on Generation 4 nuclear reactors, the future of nuclear, ? So it'll be a bit of an education session. Tony will take us through what Generation 4 nuclear reactors are and what promise they might hold for the future. So we're definitely interested in having the nuclear debates, and would welcome people who wish to register for that. Come and see me or Tony. Register via the AIE website next Tuesday evening. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Everyone, please join with me in thanking our speakers, and also to John Blick for the wonderful job he's done in moderating today's discussion. By way of a thank you, the Warren Centre asks you to nominate a book that you've found particularly inspirational in your life, and we donate that book on your behalf to a high school that's part of the University of Sydney's STEM education program. So I'll pass those out to you afterwards. A couple of things happening in the Warren Centre at the moment. We're well underway on our Women in STEM and Entrepreneurship program, so if you want to know more about that, please come and see me. And our next event is on the 16th of August, Keeping the Lights On, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure. It's very topical at the moment, and we'd love to see you there. We are seeking sponsors for this event and for our upcoming innovation lecture, which will be in October, and I'm delighted to announce that Andrew Harris, Professor Andrew Harris from Laing O'Rourke, will be the innovation lecturer this year. He's going to be speaking about the internal entrepreneur within Laing O'Rourke, his experience as a real innovator within the University of Sydney and some of the approaches he's taken to chemical and biomolecular engineering, and also what he's done in terms of using technology in radically changing the way we approach construction. So in that regard, think about virtual 3D worlds and 3D printed concrete for construction. It's quite amazing. So if you're interested in knowing more about that event, please come and see me. And we'll soon be announcing dates. Andrew's really busy. His schedule is quite a challenge. So that's an engineering feat in itself. We also have our weekly newsletter, The Prototype. If you're not subscribed to this, please come and see me. We know it goes as far as Singapore and New York, and it gets very well received. And we are looking for sponsors for that. So please come and see myself or Ashley if you have any questions. And thank you very much for joining us this morning for this discussion. Thank you.